His name is Caleb Hale, 32 years old. And the summer he came back to Gravel Creek, Tennessee, he did something that made the entire town stop, stare, and laugh. He started digging a pond, not a garden trench, not a drainage ditch. A full, sprawling pond carved into the corner of his grandfather Earl's best farmland, the kind of land that could grow soybeans, corn, alfalfa. The kind of land families had bled over for generations without wasting a single square foot. Caleb was broad-shouldered, unhurried, with the kind of steady presence that made people look twice even when he wasn't doing anything worth watching. He'd left the valley at 18, spent years doing work nobody in town fully understood, and came home with no explanation and no apology, just a pair of worn boots and a look in his eyes like he'd already decided something the rest of them hadn't figured out yet. Old Ray Cutter leaned against his fence post, watching Caleb guide a rented excavator through red clay like he'd done it 1,000 times. Shook his head slow. That man's lost his damn mind. Feed store laughter came easy. Trucks slowed on the county road, drivers craning their necks, then pulling away, shaking their heads. Someone called it a crying waste. Another said it was proof that leaving home makes a man forget what land is for. Nobody took Caleb seriously, not the old-timers, not the neighbors, not the people who'd spent their whole lives reading seasons working soil and believing they understood exactly how this valley worked. They were wrong. Within a year, every well in the valley would begin to fail. Let me tell you something about Caleb Hale, because this man is not what you think. He doesn't talk much, never has. Not shy, not broken, just quiet in a way that unsettles people. The kind of quiet that fills a room instead of disappearing from it. The kind that makes you wonder what he knows that you don't. Growing up, he wasn't the kid who won trophies or owned the hallway. He sat in the back of the classroom, listened more than he spoke, watched everything, and I mean everything. The way Barton Run slowed to a crawl, each July while everyone else was swimming in it. The places where moss dried out first and where it stayed green weeks longer than it should. Which patches of field the cattle refused to graze, which slopes held moisture 3 days after rain while the rest turned to dust by noon. He left Gravel Creek at 18. Nobody knew exactly where he went. Some said he worked pipeline jobs out west. Others heard he spent time at a university, not as a student, but haunting the geology department, like a man looking for answers to questions nobody else was asking. When he came back at 32, something had changed. Not his face still sharp-jawed, still that lean intensity that made women in town hold eye contact a beat too long. What changed was behind his eyes. A certainty, cold, calm, absolute. His grandfather Earl was the only person who didn't ask questions. The old man just handed Caleb a cup of coffee on the porch that first evening, sat beside him, and watched the light die across the field without saying a word. That was enough. It had always been enough between them. But here's what nobody in Gravel Creek thought to ask the question that would have saved them months of mockery and years of regret. What exactly had Caleb seen that every last one of them had missed? And why was he digging like a man running out of time? Now let me tell you about Gravel Creek. Because you need to understand the kind of place that laughed at Caleb Hale. This is not a town that breaks easy. 3 generations, 4, 5, same families, same dirt, same blood in the soil. These people survived the Great Depression with their fingernails in the ground. They survived droughts that turned rivers to dust, floods that swallowed entire harvests overnight, commodity crashes that broke proud men into silence at their own kitchen tables, and they came back every single time. So, when word spread, and in Gravel Creek, word spreads faster than fire, that Earl Hale's grandson had come home after 14 years just to tear up half an acre of perfectly good farmland to build a pond. The response was swift, unanimous, merciless, ridiculous. Every unplanted acre is money that won't grow. A pond serves fishermen, not farmers. And Caleb Hale is no fisherman. Someone ought to talk some sense into that man. Hardware store, after church, over fence lines, at the gas station before dawn. Half an acre of bottomland for a hole full of rainwater. Lord have mercy. The criticism wasn't cruel, not exactly. These were neighbors, people who'd bring you a casserole if your wife got sick and pull your truck out of a ditch at midnight without being asked. But they were blunt, the way people are, when they truly believe that someone is making the worst mistake of his life. But here's the thing about certainty. It's comfortable. It feels like wisdom. And sometimes it's the very thing that keeps you from seeing what's right in front of your face. Because while Gravel Creek was busy laughing, Caleb Hale was digging faster. And he wasn't doing it for the attention. He was doing it because he knew something they didn't. something that was already happening beneath their feet. Now, pay attention, because this is where the story turns. It started 6 months before he came home. A phone call. Earl's voice on the other end, thinner than Caleb remembered, slower but still sharp enough to cut glass. "I was cleaning out the back of the barn, found some of your great-granddaddy's things, thought you might want to see them." That was it. No explanation, no urgency, just Earl being Earl, dropping a match and walking away. Caleb drove 11 hours through the night. Didn't stop except for gas. What he found in that barn changed everything. A box, old, water-stained, smelling like tobacco and river mud, and something deeper like time itself had settled into the cardboard, stacked under a rotting tarp beside a broken seed drill and rusted fence stretchers. Inside notebooks, dozens of them, filled cover to cover in handwriting so precise it looked like a man carving his thoughts into stone. They belonged to Leland Hale Earl's father, Caleb's great-grandfather, a man who farmed this exact property from 1931 to 1967, and who was obsessive about one thing above everything else: water. Every single day for nearly 40 years, this man wrote down rainfall totals, creek levels, well depth readings, soil moisture conditions, runoff patterns, the exact color of Barton Run after a storm, because the color told him what kind of soil the water had moved through before it reached him. Caleb read every page. Laid them side by side on Earl's kitchen table, notebooks spanning 4 decades spread across the wood like a map of something nobody else had ever bothered to look for. And then he saw it. A pattern. Creek levels dropping, not crashing, just a slow, quiet descent across 40 years, so gradual that no single season would have raised an alarm. Well depths increasing, pumps working harder each decade to pull from deeper rock, the water wasn't vanishing, it was retreating, rainfall roughly stable. The sky hadn't changed. The rain still came, but the land had stopped catching it. Then tucked between 2 notebooks, like a secret, the old man had folded away and forgotten a geological survey map. County Extension Office, dated 1951, hand-marked by Leland in red ink that had faded to the color of dried blood, small X's along the ridge above the valley. Margin notes in that same carved handwriting: natural recharge area. Water moves slow here. Interception point. Caleb's hands shook when he read those words, not from fear, from recognition, the kind that hits you in the chest when you realize someone saw the same thing you see 70 years before you were born. He took the map to the county library. 3 Saturdays in a row. Cross-referencing soil surveys, historical water table records, dense academic papers on groundwater hydrology he worked through line by line, looking up words in a dictionary when he had to. And piece by piece, like a photograph developing in the dark, the picture came together. The valley was dying, slowly, silently, from the bottom up, and Caleb Hale was the only person alive who knew it. He didn't sleep that night. He sat on Earl's porch in the dark, holding his great-grandfather's map, and stared out at the field like a man watching a house burn while everyone inside is still sleeping. By morning, he knew exactly where to dig. If you want to find out whether he was right and what it cost this valley to find out the hard way, subscribe now, because this story is about to break wide open. Now here's where people really started questioning Caleb Hale's sanity. Because the pond, the thing they already thought was the dumbest idea in the history of Gravel Creek, wasn't enough for him. Not even close. He started reshaping it. Early morning, before the sun cleared the ridge, Caleb was already down in that hole, shirtless, covered in red clay from his neck to his boots, moving earth with a precision that didn't look like digging. It looked like surgery. He deepened one end of the pond, carved it down into the earth like he was reaching for something beneath the bedrock. Then he shaped the banks into a long, gradual slope, a slow water zone designed to capture rainwater and let it percolate into the earth rather than running off. Along the uphill edge, he constructed a series of shallow berms, small earthwork ridges placed in a pattern that looked random to anyone driving past but was anything but. Each one positioned Ciceria to catch surface water and redirect it slowly, gently, inevitably, toward the deepest part of the pond. Along the perimeter he planted, not crops, native grasses, deep-rooted wildflowers, species chosen specifically for roots that could reach 4 or 5 feet into the earth, roots that would hold banks, stable filter, runoff, and create tiny underground channels for water to follow deeper into the soil. To anyone watching, and people were always watching, it looked insane. The ridicule evolved. Before, the laughter had been light, almost affectionate. Not anymore. Now there was an edge to it, because people were starting to feel the drought in their bones. And here was Caleb Hale making the strangest project in the county even stranger, on purpose. That Hale boy is out there moving dirt again. At this point, I think it's a personality disorder. You see what he planted up there: wildflowers, while the rest of us can't keep our corn alive. The words got back to Caleb. They always do in a town that size. He said nothing, just wiped the clay off his hands, picked up another seedling, and pressed it into the bank like he was stitching a wound closed. Because that's exactly what he was doing. One evening, after a day when 3 separate people had told Earl his grandson was ruining the property, the old man walked down to the pond carrying 2 glasses of iced tea. Didn't say a word about the talk, just handed Caleb a glass, stood beside him, looking at the shaped banks and the young plants taking root, and nodded once. "Your great-granddaddy would have understood this," Earl said, quiet, like he was telling Caleb a secret. "He'd have been right down here beside you." It was the only time anyone in that valley said anything to Caleb that wasn't criticism. He didn't respond, but his hands stilled for a moment, and when he went back to work, he moved a little faster. This is the part of the story where nobody is laughing anymore. Spring came to Gravel Creek the way it always did, slow, cautious, smelling like wet earth and dogwood blossoms. Farmers watched the sky, waited for the rain that always came to refill what winter had borrowed. The rain came. The water didn't come back. Barton, Run, the creek that had cut through this valley since before anyone alive could remember, didn't recover. It came back halfway, thin, hesitant, moving through its channel like something that had lost confidence in itself. The Dennison family's well 3rd generation never failed, not in the drought of '88, not in the brutal summer of '07 started cycling longer and longer. Mrs. Dennison mentioned it at a town meeting. "Old pipes, probably." Gene Purdy's spring along his north fence line, reliable water within living memory, thinned to a seep by June. Gone by July. The soil cracked open in early April, deep, jagged, fissures wide enough to lose your boot heel in, the kind of cracks that don't say dry spell, the kind that say, something beneath you has moved away and is not coming back. And then June came. June came like a door, slamming shut, the Callaway place. Thursday morning, 6:15. Dave Callaway walked out to his barn the way he'd walked out 10,000 mornings before, turned on the pump to fill the stock tank. And then he heard something he'd never heard in his life. Air. The pump sucked air, a long, hollow, gasping pull of nothing like the earth had exhaled its last breath and had nothing left to give. The well technician dropped a camera down the shaft. The water table had dropped below the pump intake. Not by inches, by feet. "I'd start hauling water if I were you." Dave Callaway had farmed that land for 28 years. His father farmed it before him. His grandmother was born in the house he ate breakfast in that morning, and now a stranger was telling him the water was gone. By end of the month, 12 families, 12 wells, 12 pumps pulling nothing but air. Families hauling water from town in 50-gallon containers. Lines forming before dawn, men who'd never asked anyone for anything, standing with empty tanks and faces that looked 10 years older than last month. Livestock suffered, cattle losing condition, horses restless, chickens dropping production, small operations on thin margins making decisions that don't let you sleep at night. Sell the herd or watch them suffer. Drill deeper at $12,000 a hole with no guarantee. Or walk away, lock the gate, leave the land your great-grandfather cleared with his hands. Corn leaves curled inward like fists clenching. Beans yellowed weeks early. Farmers walked their rows at dawn not to work, just to stand in the middle of what they were losing. Gravel Creek was scared. The quiet kind of scared. The kind that sits in your kitchen at 2 a.m. and does math you don't want to do. And somewhere in the middle of all that fear, people started looking at something they'd spent over a year laughing at. The pond. Caleb Hale's pond. Sitting at the edge of the valley, quiet, full, untroubled, holding water like it had made a promise to the earth and intended to keep it. Now let me explain what Caleb understood that the valley had forgotten. Most people think of groundwater like a bucket. Rain fills it up, you pump from it, more rain comes. Simple, and completely wrong. Groundwater is a vast, slow, ancient system. Water moving through layers of porous rock, the way blood moves through capillaries. And it doesn't get refilled from everywhere equally. It gets refilled from specific points on the surface, called recharge zones, places where geology lets water sink deep into the earth instead of running off. Imagine a body with 100 veins, but only 3 or 4 arteries. Block those arteries, and the body keeps functioning for a while, decades even. Everything looks fine on the surface. Until one day, a man turns on his pump and pulls nothing but air. The valley had been destroying its own recharge zones for 50 years. Development along the ridge houses, roads, parking lots paved over land that once let rainfall soak deep. Farming practices, heavy tillage, soil compaction, removal of native vegetation further sealed the earth shut. Each generation inherited land that absorbed a little less water, but because the aquifer was massive, nobody noticed. The wells still worked, until they didn't. Leland Hale noticed. That's what those notebooks were. 40 years of watching the earliest symptoms of something nobody else could see. Leland saw the disease. He didn't live long enough to see the collapse, but his great-grandson did, and that geological survey map showed the last remaining recharge point in the valley that hadn't been paved over or compacted into uselessness. The corner of Earl Hale's property, right where Caleb dug his pond, a pond at that precise location, shaped to maximize volume, slow surface flow capture, runoff, and maintain permeability, didn't just hold water, it fed the aquifer. Every inch of rain that soaked into that depression moved downward through fractured limestone into the underground reservoir that every well in Gravel Creek depended on. The pond was not a pond. It was a funnel, catching water the valley was losing and feeding it back into the system that kept everything alive. Caleb had not come home to waste his grandfather's land. He had come home to save a valley that was dying in its sleep. And while they were laughing at him, he was fighting for them. Now, watch this. Everything I've told you, the notebooks, the map, the science, none of it matters if the pond doesn't work. And the world was testing Caleb Hale with everything it had. In the middle of all that devastation, Caleb's pond held, not just held, thrived. Full calm, still reflecting the sky like a mirror laid flat against the earth. Banks green with native grasses, roots reaching deep, doing exactly what he'd designed them to do. But the pond wasn't the real proof. Earl's well never failed. Let me say that again. In a valley where 12 families lost their water, where pumps pulled air, and men who'd never begged stood in line with empty tanks and hollow eyes, Earl Hale's well never failed. Not once, not one day. The pump turned on, the water came, every single morning. Coming from the pond, from every inch of rain Caleb had captured, slowed, held, and fed into the fractured limestone beneath his grandfather's property. 3 neighboring properties sharing the same geology, their wells stressed, but never hit critical, never failed. Close enough to catch the edge of what Caleb was putting back into the ground. 3 families who had no idea a man they'd mocked was the reason they still had water. The cattle on Earl's property came through in condition that made neighboring farmers stop their trucks and stare. Coats smooth, ribs covered, animals standing knee-deep in green grass next to a pond full of water. Dave Calloway drove past one afternoon, stopped. Sat there with the engine running, staring at Earl's green pasture, while his own cattle were down 200 pounds average. Hands tightened on the steering wheel until his knuckles went white. He sat there a long time. Then he drove away without saying a word. Then came the visit that changed everything. A county soil and water conservation technician named Sarah Marsh was driving the valley, assessing drought impact, property to property, documenting damage. She reached the Hale property, and she stopped walking. I came over the rise expecting more of the same, dry ground, stressed vegetation, and instead I'm looking at a full pond, green banks, and cattle in good condition, and I literally said out loud, "What am I looking at?" She spent 2 hours there, found Caleb at the far end of the pond, kneeling, writing in his own notebook, recording water levels the way his great-grandfather had taught him without ever knowing he was teaching. He walked her through everything, Leland's data, the geological map, the academic papers, dog-eared, highlighted, cross-referenced. Sarah Marsh stood at the edge of that pond with Leland's notebooks in her hands and didn't say anything for a long time. When she finally spoke, "How old are you again?" Caleb looked at her, didn't smile. "Old enough." She came back 1 week later with a colleague, a hydrologist from the state university, and a camera crew from the county extension office. The man who'd spent over a year being laughed at was about to be studied. Now, I need you to understand something. It would be easy to imagine a scene where the whole town gathers and says, "We were wrong," and everyone claps, and the credits roll. That's not how it works. Not in real life, not in Gravel Creek. What happens is quieter, and in its way, so much more meaningful. It starts with Ray Cutter. Remember Ray? That man's lost his damn mind. Ray shows up on a Wednesday, doesn't call ahead, just appears at the edge of the property, truck parked on the shoulder, walking slow toward the pond with his hands deep in his pockets and his jaw set like a man walking into a conversation he's been rehearsing for days. He stands at the pond's edge. A long time. Caleb is there, working, always working, doesn't look up, just keeps shaping earth with his hands while the man who laughed loudest stands 10 feet away staring at water that shouldn't be there but is. The silence lasts 2 minutes, maybe longer. The kind that carries every joke, every headshake, every kitchen table verdict between 2 people who both know exactly what was said. Ray speaks first. "How'd you build those berms?" Not, "I'm sorry." Not, "I was wrong." Just, "How'd you build those berms?" And if you don't understand why that question means more than any apology, you don't know men like Ray Cutter. Men like Ray don't say "I was wrong" with words. They say it with curiosity, by showing up uninvited and asking how something works. because asking means admitting they don't know. And for a man like Ray Cutter, that is as close to kneeling as he will ever come. Caleb answers, walks Ray along the berm line, explains the angle, the height, where the water goes and why it matters. Ray listens, really listens. When Caleb finishes, Ray nods slow, turns and walks back to his truck. At the door he stops, doesn't turn around. Good pond, he says, quiet, almost to himself. Then he drives away. 2 days later, Gene Purdy comes. His spring had been dry 4 months. He'd sold his best breeding bull the previous week. He asks about the plants, the root systems, whether they'd grow on his side of the valley. Caleb answers everything. Same patience. No judgment for a man who'd said wildflowers while the rest of us can't keep our corn alive. Then the Calloway family, Dave and his wife Margaret. Dave brings his son, 16 years old, makes the boy stand at the pond and listen, makes him hear every word. Because Dave Calloway has learned something that cost him more than money. He's learned what it looks like when the person everyone ignores turns out to be the only one paying attention. Then 4 farmers, Saturday morning, like a delegation, nobody appointed. They walk the property in a slow, serious line, stand at the deep end, and stare into the water like they're looking for something they lost. They are. They're looking for the moment they should have listened. That moment is gone, but the pond is still here, and Caleb is still willing to help. The laughter doesn't end with a bang. It ends the way jokes always end, when the thing they're mocking turns out to be right, in a slow, uncomfortable silence that nobody acknowledges. By autumn, 4 families break ground on ponds of their own. Caleb helps plan 2 of them. No one asks him to. He just shows up, walks their land, reads the slope, identifies the best recharge position, explains berm construction in plain language, draws diagrams in the dirt with a stick. No condescension, no satisfaction at being right, nothing that would make a single person feel smaller than they already feel. Because Caleb Hale did not do this to be right. He did it because the valley needed water, and he knew how to give it back. County Conservation Office publishes a case study. Recommends the Hale Pond model for water-stressed agricultural communities. A teacher brings it into her classroom. A graduate student contacts Earl to include the pond in a research project. Earl says yes. Then, talk to my grandson. The man that Gravel Creek had laughed at for over a year was now being cited, studied, consulted. And the strangest part, Caleb didn't seem to notice. Or maybe he noticed and simply didn't care, because the attention was never the point, the vindication was never the point was the water. The point was always the water. There is a moment after the scientists leave, after the neighbors stop laughing and start listening, when Gravel Creek moves on, not forgets, moves on. The wells stabilize, the scars don't disappear, but the valley breathes again, and that's when you see who Caleb Hale really is. He's at the pond. 6 in the morning, mist rising off the water like breath from something alive beneath the surface. Light coming in low and gold, catching the native grasses taller now, thicker, moving in the wind like they've always been there. He's sitting on the bank, boots in the mud, notebook open on his knee, writing down water levels, the condition of the banks, which grasses are spreading, where the berms need reinforcing, small things, the kind that only matter if you believe the difference between a valley that lives and a valley that dies is measured in inches of water and minutes of attention. A heron lands at the far end of the pond, stands motionless in the shallows, watches the water with the same patience Caleb watches it. 2 creatures built for the same thing, stillness, observation, the long discipline of being present and asking nothing except the truth. Somewhere behind him, on the porch of the house his great-grandfather built, Earl stands with a cup of coffee going cold in his hand, watching his grandson, sitting on a muddy bank at 6 in the morning with a notebook and a pencil, doing exactly what Leland did 90 years ago on this same piece of earth, continuing something, carrying it forward. A thread running through 4 generations of Hale men who understood that the land doesn't speak to people who aren't listening. Earl feels something he can't fully name. Pride, yes, but something older, deeper, recognition. The feeling of watching someone find the place they were always meant to be and settle into it with a certainty so complete it looks like peace. Seeing your own blood do the thing you hoped they would, not because you told them to, but because something in them knew. The way water knows which way is down. Earl watches Caleb write in that notebook and sees Leland's hands. Sees something that didn't die when Leland died, something that went underground, moved slowly through the years the way water moves through limestone, and surfaced again in a man sitting in the mud at dawn, doing the work that matters. The coffee goes cold. Earl doesn't drink it. He just stands there, watching, the way Hale men watch, quietly, completely, with everything they have. Down at the pond, Caleb closes the notebook, looks out across the water, past the heron, past the green banks, past the property line, to the valley beyond, The valley that laughed at him. The valley he saved anyway. He doesn't smile, doesn't perform, he just breathes, and the pond breathes with him. Let me ask you something, and I want you to sit with this before you answer. Have you ever been laughed at for something you knew was right? Have you ever felt the weight of every pair of eyes telling you you're wrong, you're foolish, you're wasting your time, while something inside you, quiet and certain, told you to keep going? Because that's what this story is really about. Not water, not geology. It's about attention. The long, quiet, unglamorous practice of looking at something, really looking at it until it tells you what it needs you to know. Not what you want to hear, what it needs you to know. Caleb Hale had that wisdom at 32, and he probably had it at 14, sitting on Earl's porch, watching the creek slow, watching the moss dry, watching while the world around him talked louder and saw less. Was Gravel Creek wrong to question him? No. Skepticism is healthy. A man shows up after 14 years and starts tearing up prime farmland. You should ask questions. That's not where they went wrong. They went wrong in the space between the question and the answer. They asked, "What is that fool doing?" and didn't wait for the response. They decided, without walking across the field, without looking at the notebooks, without asking Caleb a single question about why he was digging, what he'd found, what he knew, and while they were deciding with total certainty, with the comfortable conviction of people who have never been proven wrong, the water was leaving, right beneath their feet. Sometimes the loudest voices aren't the ones paying the closest attention. And sometimes the person everyone dismisses is the one quietly preparing for a future nobody else can see. Caleb Hale dug anyway, in the heat, in the laughter, in the silence that's worse than laughter, the silence of being completely alone with a truth nobody else believes. And the pond they laughed at became the reason an entire valley still had water when every well ran dry. Not because of luck, not because of magic. Because one person paid attention when no one else would. So I'll leave you with this. What are you paying attention to that nobody else sees? What truth are you carrying that the world hasn't caught up to yet? What's the thing inside you? Quiet. Certain, impossible to explain, that keeps telling you to move forward, even when every voice around you says stop. Because somewhere out there, right now, there's a valley that needs what you know. The question is whether you'll start digging, even when they laugh. If this story moved you, if it made you think about someone who was doubted before they were understood, share it. Send it to that person who needs to hear it tonight. Drop a comment and tell me what's your pond. Subscribe. Because the next story might be the one that changes how you see everything. I'll see you in the next one.